Today, I'd like to show you how to paper foundation piece. This method works for all paper foundation piecing patterns because they are all sequential, numbered from 1 to however many papers you have. I like to call my method STP, which stands for sew, trim, press, but you can remember it by remembering the motor oil, STP. Because if you don't sew, trim, and press in that order, you will not be able to come back to those and do it later. I'll show you what I mean. This is the block we're going to be making today. It's a simple square and a square. I'm going to start with my center piece. One of the important things to remember in paper foundation piecing is that you always want to cut your fabric nice and large. Don't scrimp on your pattern pieces. It just makes it a big hassle. The next thing you want to do is turn your sewing stitches down to a very tight stitch so that your paper is easy to rip off. The first piece on every pattern is always going to be right side down. Every piece of fabric after that will be right side up. Your pattern is printed on paper. I just use copy paper. Some patterns come with tissue paper or other kinds of paper. They're all great. Simple, cheap copy paper works just fine. The patterns are numbered, starting with number 1. And just to make it easier for you, and so we don't forget, I'm going to put a line on, a highlighter line, on the line I'm going to sew. That way I won't mistakenly sew the wrong line. So, with my first piece, right side down, I'm going to place my pattern, place my thumbs on the edge of the line that I'm going to be sewing, and come down over my pattern, making sure that it's on there squarely. If you need to, you can put a pin in that. My next piece is this little white triangle, and this is where my method comes into play. I want you to place, this is going to go here, so it'll flip that way. I want to place the edge of the fabric that I'm going to sew horizontal across my body. Then I'm going to take this line in between my thumbs and I'm going to bring it up to the piece and just peek over and make sure that it is centered on that piece. I do not have to lift this up to the light to make sure that it's going to fit. I know that it's going to fit because I'm following my method. I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch before my line, and I'm going to stitch with a small stitch right on my line, about 1/4 of an inch past the end of the line. Lift up your needle, snip your threads, so that was sew. I can remove my pin. Now we're going to trim, STP, sew, trim, press. I like to trim with scissors because I've always liked to cut fabric with scissors. Some people will take this over to their cutting board and do this with their rotary cutter. To me, that wastes time and I just have to get up and come back, or I could do it here. But I just like to cut it with the paper at approximately 1/4 of an inch. Now I've done sew, I've done trim, and I'm going to press. At this point, I just use a wood iron or a plastic wood iron to crimp my fibers of my fabric, and I'm ready to do my next piece. I've done number 1, number 2, my next piece is number 3. So the line between number 1 and number 3 is the one I'm going to sew on. Again, I take my next triangle. This is the one I'm going to sew. I place it horizontally across my body. I pick up my piece, place my thumbs at the end of my line, and drop that down centered over. I know that it's going to fit. I cut my fabric amply, and I'm going to sew on my line. I will repeat this for the next two pieces, and then we'll move on to the final outer triangles. I'm going to be sewing along the long edge of the triangle. I'll put that across my body horizontally. And I want to sew the next number, which is number 6. So I'm going to mark that line so I don't get confused. Grab it with my thumbs, making sure I have the fabric, and place it, center it over this triangle, leaving approximately 1/4 inch seam. Turn it, sew it. That was sew. Next we trim. The reason we trim before I press is because if you don't do it now, you will cover it up and you will not be able to come back to it and trim it later, and you'll have that excess underneath your pieces. So, trim, press. Again, this can be done with your iron if you keep an iron close to your sewing machine. Next, I'm going to go with piece number 7. So I'm going to mark that's the next line I'm going to do. Put piece number 7 across, horizontal to my body, right side up, thumbs on the edge of the line, and sew. Sew, trim, press. I'll finish these last two triangles and we'll show you how to finish the outer edge of the border. You can chain piece paper foundation. You just end up with a lot more thread in between your pieces than you normally would on conventional chain piecing. But when I'm doing blocks that are all the same, I do chain piece them. Sew, trim, press. The beauty of foundation paper piecing is that you don't cut your points off because you're sewing on a pattern that is already on the paper. It's exact and your piece comes out exact and there's no stretching of your fabric. Now I want to secure this so that I can trim it. So what I like to do is sew in the seam allowance 1/8 inch away from the seam line. So this is a stay stitching. It will be hidden in the seam. I like to remove the very outer edge of my paper before I trim the block. So I'm going to fold this over on the stitching just to get it started and make it a little bit easier to rip off. I'll rip out that outer edge. Oftentimes I leave a larger piece of paper out here, but this particular block was on the size of copy paper that didn't leave a whole lot of extra. So I have ripped the outer edge of the paper off, and now I'm going to trim it to the right size, but keep in mind you have to have your seam allowance. So this inner black line is the seam line where I'll be sewing it to the adjacent block. So I want to put my ruler down with the 1/4 of an inch on top of that black line so I can trim out a 1/4 of an inch. Don't trim to the edge of the paper or you will not have a seam allowance. Again, put your ruler down on the black seam line, leaving a 1/4 of an inch to the right of it, and trim. Ruler down on the 1/4 of an inch black line, leaving a 1/4 of an inch to the right, and trim. And the last one. Now the paper is, my block is ready. It's the right size. I've got seam allowance all the way around, and my paper is ready to rip off. Usually I do this in front of a good movie. It'll come right off. And I just work my way into the center. And that's it. I would like to show you one block of my new pattern called Spring's Glorious Pathway, because it's a little more advanced paper foundation piecing, and I'd like you to see how I do that. But this is the piecing method called STP, sew, trim, press. Thanks.